I don't know how you feel about New Year's resolutions. As Jeff kind of hinted at earlier, I too am kind of ambivalent about them. Sometimes I make them and sometimes I don't. But whenever I do make them, I seem to always break them. What I will say, though, is that there's something about a new year that invites reflection. Maybe you've experienced that over the past few days. Even if you're not interested in New Year's resolutions per se, maybe you felt something of an added momentum towards growth. A new year kind of has this built-in energy to it. It's a time when we often seek to make changes. As the year turns from 2025 to 2026, we often look back on the year that was and look forward to the year that will be. My guess is that David didn't write this psalm on New Year's Eve, but I do think that this psalm is meant to do something like what a new year often does. Like a new year, this psalm invites us to be reflective. It begins with a searching question. O Lord, who shall sojourn in your tent? And the answer to that question is a sketch of the kind of person that truly reflects God, a person who is sturdy, a person who is truthful, a person who is honorable, a person who is faithful, a person who is enduring. And so this psalm seeks to move us towards growth by giving us a sketch of someone to whom we should aspire. And the good news is that through Jesus, this is the kind of person that God is making each and every one of us to be. So today we're looking at Psalm 15 because what we really want is to move towards change that lasts a lifetime rather than just a few weeks. In verse 1, David parallels who shall sojourn in your tent with who shall dwell on your holy hill. If you were with us during our Leviticus series, you have a good idea of what the tent is. Basically, the tent was this movable meeting place between God and his people. That's why the word sojourning is fitting here. Eventually, this movable tent found its resting place in Jerusalem on God's holy hill. The tent one day becomes the temple, which is obviously much more fixed. But even in David's day, the tent came to dwell on God's holy hill. And so the question that David is asking is something like, who is the kind of person that embodies a relationship with God? Who is the kind of person that represents what God values? Maybe you've asked a question like that before in your life. If you've sought to hire somebody or if you've sought to build a team, you may have asked the question of who's the kind of person that embodies what our company is all about? Who's the kind of person that would represent the kind of things that we most value? Or if you're going to go on a date, you may have asked that kind of question too. Who's the kind of person, the kind of values in a person that I'm looking for? Or if you're thinking about college, different college options, you might have asked the question, what's the kind of person that best fits in at the University of Illinois? Each of these questions are ways that we try to get at values. Because values, they're kind of abstract. It's not impossible to think about values abstractly, but it's much more helpful, certainly more fun, to think about them in a real life context, to think about values in a real life human being. If I were to ask you who is the ideal Apple Genius Bar employee, you might have a picture of someone that comes into your mind. You could likely describe them. You could describe how they would interact with customers, the kind of knowledge base they would have, maybe even the way that they dress. And it's by thinking about this flesh and blood Apple Genius Bar employee, you would get a decent picture of what Apple, the company, is all about. Thinking about a person wearing a blue shirt, holding an iPad who's trying to fix your computer is a more tangible way to understand what Apple values. So when David asks, O Lord, who shall sojourn in your tent? Who shall dwell on your holy hill? He's trying to get us to think about a real person who represents God. a person who embodies a relationship with God and the values of God. The kind of person that when you see them, you say, that's what God's all about. There's this movie that I really enjoy called The Odd Life of Timothy Green. And in it, there's a husband and wife that really want to have a kid, but they can't. They've struggled with infertility for a number of years. And so on the night that they're trying to come to terms with that reality, they have this kind of beautiful, moving conversation. The husband turns to the wife and he says, "Just for tonight, can we have a kid?" The scene continues on, and the husband says, the kind of kid that you always believe. The wife says, "Someone honest. Yeah, you want a truth teller." And the husband says, "Yeah, I do. I want one like that." And the wife says, "Oh, but our kid can't be perfect." And the husband, "Yeah, I don't want one of those annoying perfect kids. How about this? Honest to a fault." Yes, we have a winner. And they go on to talk about him being just an average athlete, but one time he scores the game-winning goal. And it's heartwarming and it's heartbreaking. And I think that that's exactly what David is trying to get us to think about. What kind of person reflects God? Who embodies what God is truly like? If you could dream up the ideal child of God, what would they be like? Would they be smart? Would they be funny? Would they be super spiritual? What are the characteristics that would make someone stand out as belonging to God? Who is the kind of person that would make the values of the eternal and unchanging God clear? If you feel the weightiness of that question and maybe even the excitement of that question, then you might be surprised at the way that David describes this person. Verse 2 starts to frame it this way. It gives us three different phrases. It says they walk blamelessly, they do what is right, and they speak truth in their heart. Blamelessly is the idea of being whole or complete. It means there's a kind of consistency to this person. They're a dependable person. They're a sound person. They're a sturdy person. Doing what is right is about loyalty to God. It's not so much like a moral checklist. It's much more relational. It's about seeking to do life with God. And the last phrase, speaks truth in their heart, means this person has nothing to hide. They aren't calculating, they aren't politicking, they don't speak out of both sides of their mouth. They're truthful. As one pastor said it, they are honest all the way down. Do you know anybody like this? Is there maybe a real person that has begun to be formed in your mind? Is there someone in your life that exhibits these qualities? Someone you can rely on, someone you can turn to for guidance, someone you would call if you were struggling, someone who isn't necessarily perfect, but who is consistent, someone who can be both kind and truthful at the same time. I've got a friend that comes to mind, and I won't say his name because I don't want him to get a big head, but I know that this friend is there for me. You know, whether it's texting or meeting up, I know that he'll answer. I know that he'll respond. He's dependable. If I need help, I know that I can turn to him. There's a stability to him. He can hear what I'm saying. He can empathize without being swayed or becoming reactive. And it's not like he just tells me all the things that I want to hear. It's that he has proven over time to be honest, to be honorable, to be faithful. I know he wants good for me. I know he wants me to live a life that is pleasing to the Lord. Who is the kind of person that you would expect to be the best representative of God on earth? Maybe you'd expect this person to be a super saint, someone like a Mother Teresa, right? Someone who sells everything to go live among the poor. Like, surely she's a person that beautifully represents God on earth. Or maybe you've expected this person to be some towering intellectual, some theologian whose bookshelves are buckling under the weight of theological tomes. Or maybe what comes to mind for you is someone who is very spiritual, someone who is very contemplative. Now, each of those have their place, but what Psalm 15 is pointing us towards is someone a little bit different, someone who is much more ordinary. It doesn't talk about selling everything. It doesn't talk about amassing tons of knowledge. It doesn't even talk about praying. Instead, it talks about something as everyday as the way you walk. This person walks blamelessly. It's about the way you live your life, the kind of person that you are, the way you treat other people. You know that that's the kind of stuff that God cares about. He doesn't care about how many presents you can get under the tree. He cares about the way you love your kids. He doesn't care about how many likes you get on social media. He cares about the way you treat the person who bags your groceries. The person being described in this psalm is not some super saint. They're an everyday saint. They're an ordinary person who is seeking to live out the values of God. And they are who you and I are meant to be. You are meant to be a person that reflects God. You are meant to be a person that embodies what God values. Because this is the person that each of us is meant to be, David wants us to think about what this person looks like in everyday life. The first thing that he wants us to see is in verse 3, is that they look for good in others. Verse 3 says, they do not slander with their tongue. They do no evil to their neighbor, nor do they take up a reproach against a friend. Each of these negative commands draws attention to our mouths, to our words. Each of these has to do with our speech. That word slander, it's kind of funny. It's literally the word for tongue. You could translate it as he does not go about on his tongue. And what's being expressed is someone who goes around looking for dirt. And that day, dirt or gossip would have been spread by your tongue. You hang around in a corner, listen for some juicy information, and then you go about spreading it with your tongue. And this kind of behavior is just as common in our day as it was in David's, right? We don't need to hang around in an alley. We can just turn on our phones. That's how this kind of information is often spread nowadays. And it would be easy to kind of focus our attention on that, to focus our attention on our phones or things of that nature, on the external behavior. But God cares about the heart. Why would someone slander? Why would someone seek to tear another person down with their tongue? In part, it gives a sense of control. But I think beyond that, it's about trying to make oneself look better. Slander and gossip are ways to avoid the growth that we need. The growth of learning how to speak the truth in love. The growth of learning how to repair in a relationship. The growth of seeing the good in someone else. When we turn our attention away from the person that we should aspire to be and towards tearing someone else down, we aren't reflecting the reality of the God who is in our midst. God is at work restoring things to wholeness, restoring us to wholeness, and so we should use our words to further the good work that he has begun. In verse 4, David gives us another example of this person. He says that they honor the honorable. In verse 4, in their eyes, a vile person is despised, but they honor those who fear the Lord. I think what's being said is related to what a society or a culture values. Much like looking at an Apple employee tells you about Apple, looking at the heroes or the celebrities of a society give you a glimpse into the values of that society. So David is saying that we should honor people, we should honor institutions that promote the good rather than those that promote destructive behavior. It was about 5 or 6 years ago that Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, was in the spotlight in our culture. There was a documentary that came out and then a movie that came out, and I think pretty much everyone agreed that Mr. Rogers was like a breath of fresh air. There was something about the goodness of Fred Rogers, the kindness, the thoughtfulness, the gentleness, that for a moment was life-giving. But even more than that, I think he was an example of someone to whom we should aspire. I think people were drawn to Mr. Rogers because he was reflecting what God is like. He was a glimpse into the character of God. When people saw the way he treated people, they saw a different way that they could treat people. They saw the way that God treats people. Promoting a culture that honors the honorable is how God moves us towards the good. And in verse 4, David talks about how this person is faithful. They swear to their own hurt and they do not change. That phrasing is a little strange. What does it mean to swear to your own hurt? The idea here is someone who takes their commitments so seriously that even when things aren't going their way, they stick to it. You think of the captain that swears an oath to take care of the ship and everyone on board. If something goes wrong, they'll be the last one off the ship. Or if that thing's going down, they're going to go down with the ship because they have sworn to their own hurt. So we could think of the vows that we make, our marital vows, or if you're a medical professional, you could think of the oaths that you take. Of course, there's those kind of bigger things, those vows that we give our lives to, but there's also just like everyday things like telling someone we'll show up where we're going to show up. We'll be at the meeting on time. These are ways that we keep our word. These are ways that we can seek to be faithful in our everyday lives. And these concrete, these everyday examples are far from a comprehensive list. There are just a few scenarios, and there are so many more that we could think of. This psalm itself, if you keep going, has a few more examples in it. But even just looking at these few examples is meant to spur us on to think about other areas of our lives. What are some ways that we could reflect God at school? What are some ways that you could reflect God at work? Like prayer is good, Bible studies are good, but this psalm is helping us to see something. It's that our character is what reflects God most clearly. It is the kind of people we are that makes the values of God tangible. It is the way we treat people that shows forth the God who is in our midst. There is something truly wholesome about this kind of person. They are more like a hand-painted masterpiece than an AI-generated image. They're more like a classic novel than a beach read. Verse 5 says it this way: the person who does these things will never be moved, which means that the person we are describing has a staying power to them. They're stable and they're sturdy, yes, but they're also enduring. They're not like fashion trends which go in cycles. Instead, this is a person who is always in style. Honesty and honor and faithfulness, those are the things of substance. Those are the things that truly last. As we've been reflecting on this person, I wonder if you've had a question in the back of your mind. Maybe you've had the thought, what makes this different than a New Year's resolution? What makes seeking to be honest and honorable and faithful different than the more common resolutions like read more books or eat more vegetables? And the answer has to do with the assurance we are given in verse 5. The person who does these things will never be moved. If you've watched that movie, The Odd Life of Timothy Green, then you know that the morning after the husband and wife dream up their ideal child, he appears out in the garden. And Timothy is even better than they could have imagined. He is honest all the way down. He is kind-hearted. He sees the good in people that they couldn't even see in themselves. But Timothy has a secret. He didn't just appear in the garden. He actually grew from the garden. He's like a plant. So Timothy has these little green leaves on his legs, and when the last leaf is gone, he will be gone too. His mom and dad, they try to cover up these leaves. They try to hold on to Timothy as long as they can, but Timothy just kept giving away his leaves. His leaves were like kind of symbolic gifts of the goodness that he was seeking to spread. So he gave one to his aunt that loved music, to a friend that was an outcast, to an older man that had a strained relationship with his son. And near the end of the movie, Timothy writes his mom and dad a letter. He says, "Dear Mom and Dad, about my leaves, I gave them all away. It's what you do with gifts." The beautiful thing about that movie is that Timothy changes people's lives by giving away his own. He goes around doing good for people all throughout town, people who had lost hope, people who had made a mess of relationships, people who just needed a little bit of encouragement, people in his everyday, ordinary town. And you could think about what David is saying kind of like that. That is one way to understand the person who does these things will never be moved. The person who does these things will be like Timothy Green. Their good deeds will live on through the lives of those they touch. But there's another way to understand it. There's some truth to that. But David is actually pointing us to something even greater. David is pointing us to a life that is even more odd than Timothy Green's. You see, the person being described in this psalm is not first and foremost you and me. It's not David. No, the person being described in this psalm is Jesus. Jesus is the wholesome person of God made flesh and blood. Jesus is the one who speaks truth in his heart. Jesus is the one who is thoroughly honorable. Jesus is the one who has the uncanny ability to call out the good in people. Jesus is the values of God incarnate. Jesus is the one who truly represents God. Jesus is the one that fully reflects what God is like. Jesus is the embodiment of God in our midst. And so when David says the one who does these things will never be moved, we can see what that means in even greater detail than he could. It doesn't just mean that Jesus did good for a lot of people. It doesn't just mean we carry the memory of him in our hearts. It means that he is the one with ultimate staying power. He is the one that abides forever. He is the one who will endure. He is the one who has risen from the dead by the power of an indestructible life. And if you believe in Jesus, then you are united to the one who will never be moved, which means you will endure too. You will abide. You will have staying power. What makes these character qualities different than a New Year's resolution is that Jesus is the one who is growing us in them. Jesus is the one who is changing us from the inside out. If you belong to Jesus, you have been indwelt by God, and you will become a person who will never be moved. Now we will turn to a time of confession as we do each week. This is a time when we can be honest with God about ways that we struggle to reflect his values in our lives. God invites us to tell him the truth about ourselves, and that is another way that he changes us to become more like Jesus. So let's take a few moments to confess our sins to God.